It's 1942. The Atlantic Ocean, a dark, endless battlefield. Beneath its cold, rolling waves, an invisible enemy prowls. The German U-boats, sleek and silent, are winning a war that most Americans don't even know is happening. Every night, merchant ships carrying food, weapons, and soldiers from America to Britain are being hunted. Torpedoes streak through the black water, explosions rip through steel hulls, and entire convoys vanish beneath the waves. The ocean burns with oil and screams. The German Navy calls it die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. For the Allies, it's a nightmare. The numbers are staggering. In early 1942 alone, over 600 Allied ships are sunk. Each loss means supplies never reach the front lines, tanks that never roll into battle, planes that never take off, soldiers that never arrive. Britain is starving. The U.S. Navy, unprepared for submarine warfare on such a scale, watches in horror as the Atlantic becomes a graveyard. The U-boats move in packs, wolf packs. They strike fast, coordinated, and vanish before anyone can respond. The ocean is too vast, the convoys too exposed. Even with destroyers and depth charges, the Allies can't stop them. The Navy faces an impossible question. How do you fight an enemy you can't see? By spring, the crisis reaches breaking point. American admirals are desperate. Patrol planes can't cover the entire ocean, and the few aircraft carriers that exist are too valuable to risk escorting slow merchant convoys. The U-boats are cutting the Allied lifeline, and unless something changes, the war could be lost before it's even won. In the Pentagon and naval bases across the U.S., a radical idea begins to take shape. A new kind of ship, small enough to build quickly, light enough to cross the ocean, and strong enough to carry aircraft that can hunt submarines from above. But to the Navy's traditionalists, the concept sounds absurd. Tiny carriers, built on merchant hulls, with just a handful of planes? They laugh. They call them baby flattops. Impractical, dangerous, a waste of steel. Yet behind the mockery, a few visionaries refuse to give up. They understand that air power, not size, is the key to survival. Planes can spot periscopes, attack submarines, and protect convoys far beyond the range of any ship's guns. The Navy's skeptics may not see it yet, but the truth is clear to those who dare to imagine the impossible. The future of the Atlantic War won't be decided by battleships or destroyers. It will be decided by these small, scrappy floating airfields and the fearless crews who will risk everything to prove the doubters wrong. What began as a desperate gamble is about to become one of the most brilliant innovations of World War II. The baby flattops are coming, and soon the hunters will become the hunted.
The idea sounded ridiculous, even suicidal. A miniature aircraft carrier, built not for battle fleets, but for merchant convoys. The U.S. Navy's high command scoffed. "You can't land planes on a cargo ship," they said. "It'll flip in rough seas. It's a death trap." But the war wasn't waiting for perfect ideas. The Atlantic was bleeding ships every week. Something, anything, had to be done. And so, against all odds, the Navy approved a desperate experiment. Convert merchant hulls and oil tankers into small, fast, floating airstrips. They would be crude, ugly, and dangerously cramped, but they could bring aircraft into the fight. These were the escort carriers, soon to be known as baby flattops. Construction began in American shipyards that had never seen an aircraft carrier before. Welders worked day and night, turning humble cargo vessels into war machines. Engineers stripped away cargo holds and replaced them with short flight decks, barely long enough for a plane to take off. A wooden deck stretched across steel beams, and a small island tower was bolted to one side. There was no armor, no heavy guns, no glamour. But there was purpose. Each escort carrier could carry about 20 small aircraft, mostly Wildcat fighters and Avenger torpedo bombers, the same planes that had proven themselves in the Pacific. These aircraft would patrol the skies above the Atlantic convoys, spotting submarines before they could attack. The first few ships were rough. Pilots called them postage stamps on the ocean. Landing on their decks was a nightmare. The ship rolled, pitched, and swayed violently in every wave. One misjudged approach could send a plane straight into the sea. But slowly, through trial and tragedy, crews learned to master them. In the beginning, no one expected much. The Navy saw them as a stopgap, a temporary measure until bigger carriers could arrive. But the men who served on them, pilots, deck crews, and sailors, believed otherwise. They saw something powerful in these tiny giants. They called them the little ships that could. And soon, the first baby Flattops joined convoys crossing the Atlantic. Their presence changed everything. Now, merchant ships no longer sailed blind. They had eyes in the sky. Aircraft could spot U-boats from miles away, their periscopes glinting in the sun, their wakes slicing through the waves. When spotted, the baby Flattops aircraft would dive, dropping depth charges and bombs. For the first time, submarines that once attacked freely now had to hide. The hunters were starting to feel hunted. Still, most admirals didn't believe the results. They called early successes luck. They refused to see that a revolution had begun. The baby Flattops weren't perfect, but they didn't need to be. They just needed to survive long enough to save lives and prove that sometimes the smallest ships can make the biggest difference. And soon they would. Because in the next stage of the war, the Atlantic would roar with vengeance, and the tiny, impractical carriers would become the ocean's deadliest guardians.
The first baby Flattops entered service quietly. There were no parades, no newspaper headlines, just small ships and smaller crews slipping into the Atlantic under gray skies. But what they lacked in size, they made up for in courage. To most sailors, these new carriers looked like an accident waiting to happen. The decks were barely 400 feet long, about half the size of a fleet carrier. Landing a plane on them was like trying to park a car on a rooftop during a hurricane. Pilots nicknamed them bucking broncos because in heavy seas, the deck would rise and fall 20 feet in seconds. But those who served aboard these fragile ships had no room for fear. They had missions to guard the convoys, to find the enemy, and to strike before the U-boats struck them. Every takeoff was a gamble. Every landing was a prayer. The pilots of these baby Flattops became experts in improvisation. They learned to launch with barely enough runway, to hook their planes onto arresting cables while the ship pitched wildly beneath them. Some called it madness, others called it American ingenuity. And soon, that ingenuity began paying off. For the first time, the convoys had constant air cover. Wildcat fighters circled above, scanning the waves for the telltale glimmer of a periscope. Avenger bombers roamed ahead of the fleet, armed with depth charges and radar. When a submarine was spotted, the call went out, "Contact!" and within minutes, the planes were diving, releasing their payloads into the sea. The U-boats had no answer for this. What had once been a game of stealth and surprise had turned against them. The hunters were now the hunted. In 1 week alone, aircraft from escort carriers helped sink 5 German submarines. Word spread fast through the ranks of the Kriegsmarine. There were new predators in the Atlantic, and they flew. Life aboard the baby Flattops was rough. The ships were small and crowded. The flight decks were constantly wet with spray. Crews slept in cramped quarters, ate cold food, and worked around the clock to keep their planes in the air. There were no luxuries, just the hum of engines, the scream of wind, and the endless, rolling ocean. But for all their hardships, morale was high. The sailors and pilots knew they were making a difference.
Every convoy that reached Britain meant lives saved, cities fed, and the war effort strengthened. They began to take pride in the name that had once been an insult. Baby Flattops, yeah, but this baby bites. By late 1943, the results were undeniable. Convoy losses dropped sharply. German U-boat commanders reported fewer successful attacks and heavier casualties. The once invincible wolf packs were losing their edge. The small ships that the Navy had called impractical were now turning the tide of the war. The Atlantic, once ruled by fear and silence, now echoed with the engines of justice. And this was only the beginning, because the baby Flattops were about to lead the charge in a new kind of warfare, one that would change the balance of power forever.
By late 1943, the tide of the Atlantic War had begun to shift, and at the heart of that transformation were the baby Flattops. What once seemed like a desperate gamble had become the Allies' sharpest weapon against the German U-boats. The hunters, the feared wolf packs, were now being hunted themselves. For nearly 4 years, these submarines had terrorized the Atlantic. They attacked in groups, surrounding convoys like sharks in a feeding frenzy. At night, they surfaced to strike, launching torpedoes that turned cargo ships into floating infernos. The ocean had been their domain, silent, deadly, and uncontested. But now, the rules had changed. From the decks of the escort carriers, American pilots launched at dawn, flying low over the churning gray water. Their mission? To find the enemy before the enemy found them. Using new radar systems, they could detect a submarine's periscope or snorkel even through fog and darkness. The Atlantic, once a safe hunting ground for the U-boats, had become a killing field for them. In one dramatic encounter, aircraft from the USS Bogue, a baby flat-top escorting a convoy, spotted a German sub stalking the fleet. Within minutes, Avenger bombers roared into action, circling like hawks. The U-boat tried to dive, but it was too late. A pattern of depth charges tore the sea apart. When the foam cleared, only debris floated to the surface. The men aboard the Bogue cheered. Another wolf down. These victories became increasingly common. The small carriers operated as floating ambushes, baiting U-boats into revealing themselves, and then striking with brutal efficiency. The Germans, once confident, began to fear the sound of aircraft engines overhead. The Atlantic, they said, bitterly, had grown wings. Every successful attack meant more than just another kill. It meant lives saved. Merchant crews, soldiers, and civilians who would live to see another sunrise. It meant food and ammunition reaching Britain, fueling the Allied fight across Europe. But hunting the hunters came at a terrible cost. For the men aboard the baby Flattops, there was no rest. Constant tension filled the air. Every hour was a test of nerves, scanning the waves, waiting for that flash of silver that meant death was near. Planes crashed in storms. Deck crews were swept overboard. Some ships were hit by torpedoes and vanished beneath the waves they had once commanded. Still, they pressed on, because by then they understood the truth. They were no longer just protecting ships, they were protecting the future. By early 1944, German U-boat losses had become catastrophic. From 108 operational submarines, only 31 remained. The proud wolf packs of the Kriegsmarine had been torn apart, not by massive fleets or grand battles, but by a few hundred men on small, trembling ships that never supposed to work. The baby Flattops had turned the ocean into a battlefield the enemy could no longer control. The hunters were gone. The hunted had become heroes. And as the Atlantic finally grew quiet, the world began to realize these tiny ships had done the impossible.
When the idea of the baby flattop was first proposed, the admirals had laughed. They called it a child's version of a carrier, too small, too unstable, too weak to survive in real war. But by the end of 1944, no one was laughing anymore. The numbers told the story. In less than 2 years, the escort carriers had reduced the number of active German U-boats from 108 to just 31. Convoy losses had fallen by more than 80%. For the first time since the war began, Allied ships could cross the Atlantic with confidence. The transformation was astonishing. The same ships that were once mocked as floating coffins had become the backbone of the Atlantic fleet. They escorted thousands of merchant vessels, repelled countless submarine attacks, and rescued survivors from burning seas. But their greatest victory wasn't just military. It was psychological. For the sailors who once feared the silent menace beneath the waves, the roar of baby flat-top aircraft engines became the sound of hope. Every time they saw a Wildcat fighter circling overhead, they knew someone was watching the deep, someone who wouldn't let them die unseen. The crews who manned these tiny carriers became legends in their own right. They were engineers, pilots, and mechanics, young men from small towns who found themselves fighting a war on the most unforgiving ocean on Earth. Their ships had no armor, no glory, and often no recognition, but they had heart. They learned to work together in impossible conditions, fueling planes in storms, repairing engines while waves crashed across the deck, launching missions in fog so thick that they could barely see their own hands. Every landing was a brush with death, every takeoff a leap of faith. And yet, they kept flying, because they understood something the admirals never did. Victory doesn't always come from the biggest guns or the most expensive ships. Sometimes it comes from innovation, determination, and courage. From the willingness to try something new when everything else has failed. By the time the war ended, the Navy had built over 120 escort carriers. They served not just in the Atlantic, but in the Pacific, supporting invasions, rescuing downed pilots, and delivering critical supplies. The Impractical experiment had become one of the most important naval weapons of World War II. After the war, many baby flat-tops were scrapped or sold, their wooden decks stripped and steel hulls left to rust. But their legacy endured. In every modern carrier that took to the sea, in every pilot who trusted a short deck and long odds, they had changed the course of naval warfare forever. Once dismissed as toys, they ended the reign of the U-boat and proved that sometimes the smallest ships make the biggest waves. The baby flat-tops had gone from ridicule to glory, rewriting history one wave, one battle, one brave flight at a time.